Mohiuddin sir, good morning.
Sir. Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is fine in these difficult times.
Sir, I welcome on behalf of Rajeshri Shaw College of Law. I am the principal of this college, Advocate Sanjay Singh. I think we met 2 years ago in our college in a seminar, in a presentation along with Mr. Vikrant Pawar also. So we had a very good time. I discussed this with my students about 3 to 4 days ago while conducting a webinar.
Okay.
And then the thought came into our mind that we should contact you, and if you are having free time for us, kindly share your ideas and views with us. So I welcome on behalf of Rajeshri Shaw College of Law to start the meeting, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks for my introduction and the kind invite that I received from you all. Now everybody is at home, so everybody has ample of time. We can utilize that time for learning new subjects, no doubt about that. So today I'm going to talk about Cyber Law, Information Technology Amendment Act 2008. Everybody probably are aware that I'm an ex-police officer. I worked in police, Mumbai Police for long 24 years. This was instrumental in starting first cybercrime cell for Mumbai Police way back in 2001. And we started, me and our team started the first cybercrime cell, probably in India also, because that time no cyber cell existed in entire India. So I am BSc LLB. I did my LLB from Mumbai University. Then I did my PG in Cyber Law and Cyber Forensics from National Law School. I am a certified ethical hacker. I am the topmost certification in Information Security Audit. So that is CISA. Then I am certified ethical hacker, certified hacking forensic investigator. These are my qualifications. I generally wanted you all to be aware that my qualifications. So let us start with Information Technology Act. So when it came into existence, don't go by the word 2008. It came into existence in the year 2000. And India was the 13th nation in the entire world to adopt the cyber law. And it was based on the e-commerce model of United Nations. And most of the countries, they framed their law based on this particular model law on e-commerce. So our law is also based on model law on e-commerce. So every act has an objective. What is the objective of Information Technology Act? The first objective was to provide legal recognition to the transactions. What kind of transaction? E-commerce transactions. So earlier, even before 2000, there used to happen many e-commerce transactions which were not backed by any kind of law. So suppose there is a buyer and a seller and there is some kind of dispute amongst them. There was no law during those times till 2000 which could actually give given support to any of the grievance, the party which is aggrieved. So this law was, the basic objective of this law was to provide legal recognition to the e-commerce transactions. Now everyone is involved in e-commerce transactions. You buy many stuff on Amazon.com. So there is an agreement between the two parties always. You must have learnt about the Contract Act. So there is an agreement, a contract which is formed between the buyer and the seller. And if anyone has any kind of dispute, now we have Information Technology Act in place so that we can go to the court and seek the justice. The second objective of the act was filing of documents with government and e-payments. Basically nowadays what we do is we file our IT returns also online. So that has got a legal sanctity. So no one can say that it is illegal because IT Act has given a legal credence to filing of IT returns, filing of many tenders. You must have seen many people file tenders also in the form of electronic records. So all these have got legal sanctity under the IT Act, because of which we are able to file all of this on the internet. Once the IT Act came into force, there were amendments made in certain laws. And these laws were Indian Penal Code, Indian Evidence Act, Bankers Book Evidence Act, and Reserve Bank of India Act. The major amendments were made in Indian Evidence Act. In the form that earlier the evidence used to be in the form of physical evidence. Like suppose in a criminal offense, if a knife or a gun is an evidence, it's in a physical form. It is very much visible. But electronic document is not visible to the naked eye. You need a computer to understand that electronic document. So there had to be some kind of modification in the Evidence Act which could interpret digital evidence as an admissible evidence. So there is a amendment in India. There are many amendments in Indian Evidence Act wherein there is particular section which is section 65B, which talks about admissibility of electronic record, and it gives credence to the electronic evidence, saying that any copy of the electronic evidence in the form of, say, a pen drive, a printout, is considered admissible in the court of law. Because you cannot take a server to the courtroom to show that this is the evidence that we found in. You cannot take a hard disk and show to the judge saying that, see, the evidence is inside this hard disk. Probably the case may come up for the hearing after 10 or 15 years. That time probably a hard disk may not work also. So law understood all of this, and they knew that this mechanical or electronic equipments might not work at the time of the trial. So why not consider secondary evidence in the form of pen drive or paper-based documents. So any printout from the original evidence is also considered as an evidence. So there were amendments made accordingly in various laws. These are the 4 laws, major laws, in which the amendments were made. Now every law has an extent, whether it is applicable within India, whether it is applicable to Jammu and Kashmir or no, or whether it is only applicable to the rest of India, whether it is, the scope of the entire act is actually defined in extent of application. So what is the extent of this particular act, Information Technology Act? It extends to the whole of India, including Jammu and Kashmir. Now 370 has been abrogated, so even if it is not mentioned, still it is considered it is applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. And it is also applicable to the acts committed outside India. So which kind of acts this particular statute is applicable? This particular statute is applicable to the acts in which, suppose one party is sitting in one foreign country, suppose someone is sitting in UK, a hacker suppose, and he is using the network which is there in India, and is launching an attack on a server in Australia. So in such cases, since the network utilized by the hacker was there in India, we can actually apply these various sections of this act to that particular hacker, and we can register the case against that hacker. Even if he is sitting in UK and he is attacking a server in Australia, still we can register an offense against him because he used the network or the computers which resided in India. So this is one new angle to this particular act. Otherwise, all other acts you must have seen, their extent is limited to the geographical boundaries of India. During the course of learning, you will come across many sections in which access has been spoken about. This illegal access to computer system is a common sentence you will find in this Information Technology Act. So in order to, whether that particular section is applicable to a particular act, we need to first understand what is access. So what is access? So access is gaining entry into a computer system or computer network, or it is instructing or communicating with the logical, arithmetic or memory functions of computers. What is the meaning of that? So basically somebody introduces a virus into your computer, right? And then virus is actually interacting with the internal components of your operating system and making certain changes in your computer system. So though directly a hacker is not accessing your system, but he has introduced a malware which is actually interacting with the internal components of your software or the operating system or your files, then it is also considered as an access. So suppose somebody many a times in family matters, the matter comes before the court asking whether wife has a right to access her husband's phone, whether husband has a right to access to the wife's phone. So this access has to be understood in that particular format. So if the permission is granted by the husband to the wife or the vice versa, and if they are accessing it, then it is not considered as an illegal access. But if it is access without the permission of the owner of the computer or the communication device like mobile phone, then it will be considered as illegal access. So you will come across access word every now and then when you are dealing with IT laws. So there is another definition which is about computer. What is a computer? We have a general perception that computer has to have a monitor, computer has to have a keyboard, computer has to have a mouse, only then it is considered as a computer. No, nowadays you must have heard about Internet of Things. So many electronic equipments or the car or many of the equipments are actually having computing powers basically. Take your GPS device, which use wristbands. They are actually sending some kind of electronic messages to the server, and they are actually calculating your heartbeat. They are calculating the number of steps that you take every day. So these are all computing devices. So computer doesn't mean just a monitor or a laptop or a PC. Computer means many things. So this is what the definition says, and it also includes input devices such as keyboard, mouse, output devices such as printer, processing such as RAM, and then processors, Intel processor, AMD processor, storage devices such as external hard disk. So the definition of the computer is vast. So don't just think that computer is just desktop and the PC. So there are many computing equipments that are also considered as computer devices. Why we need to know the definition? Because then only you will be able to applicable those provisions of the law to the thing that is called as computer. So these are all these are all the peripheral devices which are considered as computer. Computer network, you all must be aware that LAN is an interconnection of many networks. Internet is an interconnection of many different networks. So all these are computer networks. When two or more computers are connected with each other by means of a satellite or a terrestrial line or a submarine cable which goes under the sea and connecting the computers across the world. So these are all computer networks. Communication device. This is also considered in many definitions. Now, what is a communication device? Cell phones, personal digital assistants, or combination of both, or as I said, the GPS devices or the wristbands and all those kind of devices which we use in our everyday life. They communicate, send and transmit text or video or audio or image. All those devices are considered as communication devices. We are going to come across these words when we will be talking about various sections under the chapter offenses. What is computer system? It is also it is basically a conglomeration of various computing devices and a computer network. Calculator is not considered as a computer, that we have to remember according to that definition. Now, what is data? Data or information? It is under IT Act, data and information is but the same thing. It's a representation of information, knowledge, facts, concepts or instruction which are being prepared or have been prepared, or they are in a formalized manner or not. So it is considered as anything in electronic form is data, it means. So data is intended to be processed, it's being processed or has been processed. So this is what computer is defined as. Computer is what? Basically you process, you input something which is being processed and output is given. So that is all is considered as data, and it includes computer printouts. So when we say anything related to data, printout is also considered as data which has come out of the computer. Magnetic and optical storage devices such as pen drive, hard disk, punch cards and punch tapes are becoming obsolete nowadays because they were used for the purpose of taking backups. Nowadays backups are taken straight on the hard disk or in the data centers. So punch cards and punch tapes will not come across, or something which is stored internally in the memory of the computer. So memory of the computer is what? Memory of the computer is nothing but RAM, that is a random access memory, which increases the speed of your mobile phone or your computer. In mobile phone terminology, you say 4 GB RAM ka mera phone hai, 8 GB RAM ka phone hai. So it shows that it has a faster speed than the lower version. So that's why that is memory of the computer. So there are certain exceptions to this particular law. This law is applicable to everything in electronic form, but there is one but, which says that it is not applicable to negotiable instruments defined in section 13 of Negotiable Instrument Act, other than check. So it says that whatever negotiable instruments are defined under Negotiable Instrument Act, to them it will not be attracted. Only the electronic check is valid in electronic form. Otherwise, no other negotiable instrument is valid in electronic form. That is the meaning of that particular sub-provision. In power of attorney also, you need to have power of attorney in paper-based form. You cannot have it in electronic form. Power of attorney has to be had in a paper-based form. Even trust agreement has to be in electronic form. Then testamentary disposition, a will, has to be in paper form, not in electronic form. Similarly, any contract which is related to immovable property. Suppose you want to buy a house, you want to buy a shop, so you can't have that agreement or the sale deed cannot be in an electronic form. It has to have a paper form with signatures, with registration details, with registration stamp and everything. So even this contract for sale of immovable property has to be in paper form. So these are the categories which are the exceptions to the law. So I hope whatever we spoke till now is understood by everyone. Anyone has questions on this?
Any questions from any side? Any questions?
Sir, as decided, we will have questions afterwards only.
Sir, at the end of the session, we will have the questions, sir.
Sure. Now, next part, basically, the IT Act was actually enacted with e-commerce in mind, basically, and the remaining things followed, like offences and the penalties and the compensations. The main purpose of the IT Act was to give credence to the e-commerce transactions. So major part of that, the first 3-4 chapters are based on PKI and digital signature. Although you guys as a legal professional may not come across these terms or terminology often. Once in a while you will come across this terminology, and it's a little technical. So I will not go into many depth of this particular thing, PKI and digital signature, but I will just give you an overview about this. So what is PKI and what is digital signature? You must be using these digital signatures in your day-to-day life, or even you probably not aware that this is also used behind the screen when you use various websites, such as the websites, banking websites. They have this HTTPS rather than HTTP. Those technologies use PKI. PKI is public key infrastructure. So what is that basically? So see, when in real life, when you want to send a message or a letter to someone, or you want to execute a document, you sign your document with your handwritten signature. But on internet, you cannot do that. So for that purpose, digital signature concept came into picture, and digital signature uses the technology which is called as PKI, that is public infrastructure. What is PKI? So PKI is basically, there are two sets of keys. One is called as a public key and private key. So those keys are like this. They are not like normal keys. So here if you see, google.com has this public key, which is in the form of hexadecimal numbers. Hexadecimal numbers are numbers which are from 0 to 9 and A to F. So anything falling between those numbers and letters is considered as hexadecimal. So public key of google.com. So then when you click on google.com's padlock, you will come across the google.com certificate, digital certificate. And digital certificate has a public key. So this is the public key of google.com. That establishes the fact that because of this public key, your browser is able to understand whether it is a genuine website of Google or it's a fake website. So that is the purpose of public key and private key. What is the purpose? To actually authenticate someone's identity or to maintain the secrecy of the communication. For these two purposes, and for the non-repudiation purpose. Like if you want to send an email to someone and that person wants that email to be authenticated. So when you use your digital signature, which will be in the form of your private key, that then he will be, his condition will be satisfied that you proved your authenticity. You cannot later on repudiate, saying that that email was not sent by me, because you have digitally signed it and that particular private key was in your possession. So there is a thing called as non-repudiation. So you can prove that non-repudiation, saying that yes, this is my private key or this is my digital signature. I sent you the document using my digital signature, and now you can check that digital signature using my public key, which is available publicly in a repository maintained by CCAs, that is Controller of Certifying Authority. So it is a bit technical, but just understand concept behind PKI infrastructure or public key, private key. They come in the form of dongles. Many people must have filed their IT returns using this kind of dongles. So this dongle contains the private key which just belongs to you. So in order to maintain the secrecy of your private key, which if you keep on the computer, your computer might crash or somebody might just steal that private key and use that against you. So rather than having a private key in a dongle, which is similar to your pen drive, and whenever you want to digitally sign a document, you attach that dongle to your laptop and then you digitally sign a document, an email or any kind of document that you want to execute. So in order to maintain secrecy of your private key, such private keys are stored in these kind of dongles. So these keys are basically issued by who? Certifying authorities. These are the government regulated authorities which issue these certificates, and we have few authorities here: National Informatics Center, and then SafeScript. There are many such companies which are listed here. So these companies issue digital signatures. So I hope you understood the concept of PK and digital signature. It's a very vast subject. If you really want to get into that, we will have to arrange another lecture for 1 or 1.5 hours. It's a totally different subject altogether. It's technically a little complicated, but understand the basic concept. Private key is used for non-repetition purposes to tell people that this is the document that I'm signing. You can check my sign by comparing my private key with the public key. And to encrypt the message. So if anybody intercepts your message while it is in transit, no one will be able to make sense out of it. So it is also used as an encrypting mechanism to encrypt the data that you are transmitting. So this is the second module that we took about PK and digital signature. The third module is about civil wrongs. Now you being law students must be aware what is civil and what is criminal. I'm sure about that. So civil wrongs are also there under IT Act. What are those kind of acts? So what are different kind of, what you call it, torts in civil world? Torts which can be considered as civil wrongs under the Information Technology Act. It starts with section 643. 43 has a lot of subsections, A, 43B, 43C, likewise till F, they have a lot of subsections, and most of the criminal acts also are covered under section 43A. So under IT Act, you can parallelly seek both the remedies, criminal as well as civil. Many people have done that. In case of a lot of bank frauds, people have gone to civil authorities also and they filed criminal cases also with the police authorities, with investigative agencies. So this particular section is very important from the point of view of a legal practitioner, because then as in you want to practice in cyber law, these sections, all subsections under 43A are going to come to its help, because most of the penalty compensation things are going to fall under 43A. So you'll see most of the cyber crimes are already covered in section 43, and the 43 starts, all the subsections start with one common statement saying that if any person without the permission of the owner or any other person who is in charge of a computer system or computer network. Now what is the meaning of this? The person has to be the owner of the computer, or he has been given that task to manage that computer. Like in an office, there is a network administrator or the computer administrator or the computer user. He has been given temporary access to that computer by the company. So he becomes in charge of that computer for the time being till he is on duty. So he is also considered as for the time being, he is considered as the manager of that particular computer. And without the permission of such owner or such person who is having control over that computer, if any act is committed, and what that act is, A says that without the permission of the computer owner, if somebody accesses or secures access to such computer system or computer network, this particular provision will be applicable to such persons. In short, it is an illegal access. I just spoke a few minutes back. What is an illegal access? So such kind of access will be covered under section 43A. Now what is 43B? 43B says that anybody downloads, copies, extracts any data from the computer without the permission of the owner or the person who is in charge of that computer system can be prosecuted under section 43B. So what in general parlance we say data theft. If a person working in a company, he just connects his pen drive to the computer, copies the company's data into that pen drive, takes it along with him, and sells that data or joins the rival company. In these kind of cases, we can address section 43B. So somebody is stealing data from the company, he can be penalized under section 43B. What is section 43C? It talks about virus dissemination. It means if any virus is introduced into your system by the hacker or by anyone working in the company, or somebody is having access to your computer either remotely or in person, and he introduces a virus. Viruses are not only in the form of some activity which will destroy the data in the computer, but also in the form of what you call is stealing your information. There is one virus which is called as a Trojan. Trojan, if it is introduced into computer, the hacker gets the entire control of your computer. He can see your desktop, he can have access to your camera, he can see what is happening around you with the help of the web camera. He can steal the data, he can install a keylogger. Trojan is also a keylogger. So whatever keystrokes you are making on your computer, they are transmitted across to the hacker's email ID or hacker's server. And that's how the compromises of systems are happening these days. You suddenly one fine day you realize that certain amount from your bank account is suddenly vanished. How it went? It went because you inadvertently or by mistake clicked on some link or downloaded some attachment which installed a malware, which installed a keylogger, and as and when you carried out any banking transaction, your username and password is transmitted by that malware, by that keylogger to the hacker in plain text. That is the most important thing. It goes in plain text format. Otherwise, any transaction or any communication between bank and you is always goes in encrypted format. So even if anybody intercepts it on the way, will not be able to make sense any sense out of it. But malware intercepts the keystroke even before it reaches to the computer's memory. That is how it can intercept the data in plain text, and it can send that data to the hacker, and using those banking credentials, your amount is withdrawn from your account. Unfortunately, many viruses are not able to detect those malwares, and that is the most important thing in this. So you think that you have installed an antivirus software, and you think that now it is very safe for you to carry out any kind of important transactions. No, it is not. Unless and until you have good browsing habits, it will not stop. What are good browsing habits? Not to click on any uninvited link, not to click on any videos that are coming into your Facebook timeline, because sometimes they just arouse your suspicion, arouse your some kind of message will come into your timeline saying, "I see what kind of video is there about you on the internet, on YouTube," and you suddenly click on that video because then you're put into some kind of threat. So you respond to that threat by clicking to that video, and the video asks you to download a video player, and you suddenly click on yes, and that video player is nothing but a malware that is getting installed in your computer, and that malware sends all the information, all the keystrokes from your computer to the hacker. We regularly support cybercrime cell of Mumbai Police, and we have come across these kind of cases wherein this malware, there are 30, 40, 50 malwares in the victims' computers we have seen, even after they having the antivirus installed on the computer. So it is really risky. So browsing bad websites, clicking on bad links, downloading attachment from unknown sources, you are going to invite trouble. Some malware is going to get installed without you even aware that it is getting installed, because in the the installation happens in the background. You can't see the installation pop-ups at all. So you have to be very careful about virus dissemination. And the current days, the major issue related to virus is ransomware. You must have heard about WannaCry ransomware, Paytm ransomware, no Paytm ransomware. So all these ransomware, what they do, once this kind, see basically, this kind of ransomwares are nothing but viruses. Viruses are what? They are software programs which are intended to do some damage to your computer. There is nothing. Malware is also a software. So what that software does is, or the malware does is, it encrypts the data on your computer. In ransomware cases, it encrypts the data on your computer, and they ask you some ransom, some money in return, so that your data can be decrypted. And these kind of cases are happening a lot in today's times. Many big companies have suffered because of this. One famous paint company's 1,000 computers were encrypted by a ransomware by name as Summers, and $1.7 per computer were asked as a ransom from that particular company, and that case was being investigated by CyberCell. We were assisting CyberCell in the investigation during that time. Now 43D, what is 43D? 43D says that any damage to computer will be covered under section 43D. So without the permission of the owner who is in charge of the computer system and computer network, if anybody damages or causes to be damaged any computer system, computer network, data and blah 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 blah. So anybody damages the computer, even computer data is damaged. Suppose some disgruntled employee, he has been asked to leave the company, asked to resign. So before going, what he does is he damages the data of the company. It damages the database, the customer entries, the client entries. So physically, he are not damaged to the computer. He has damaged the data, the information of the company. So in such cases, he can be held liable under section 43D. Now, disruption of computer. So what is disruption? What is the difference between damage and what is damage and disruption? The same case, without the permission of the owner, if anybody damages any computer system, computer network, data, and blah blah blah. So what is disruption? It's basically, suppose a particular software program is functioning, the company is dealing with their customers, and normal functioning of the company is going on, and suddenly a disgruntled employee or a hacker, they suddenly make some damage to the entire system and stop that particular functioning of the entire system. So company loses the business because company is not able to communicate with their client because the system is affected by some other means, like virus or by deleting certain system files. The system is not able to function, it suddenly stops, it hangs, and at such times there is substantial damage to the company resources and they lose a lot of money, sometimes in crores. Understand a company like Amazon, if suddenly stops functioning for half an hour, 1 hour, the damages will be in crores. So similar to that, this kind of offences can be covered under section 43E of the Act. DOS attack. What is DOS attack? I'll give a simple example. On a particular day when the result is announced for the 10th standard or 12th standard, what happens? The very morning, everyone who has a student in their house who have given the exam, they try to log into the board's server, and suddenly server fails and nobody is able to access that service. So this is a legitimate DOS attack, I will say. DOS is denial of service attack. The people who are supposed to get that service and to see that result, but suddenly the requests that are coming to the server, they increase in such a large number that legitimate users were not able to access that server. In DOS attack, the same thing happens. The hacker takes control of many computers on the internet. The users are totally unaware. As I said, the kind of Trojans that they install, they can have the access of your computer, and using your computer and many other 1,000 computers, they launch an attack to a targeted server like yahoo.com, google.com. There are attacks on against yahoo.com, and they bring that server down. Means the server stops functioning and the company loses business. So DOS attack is a collective attack of many computers on a single server. It is caused with a malicious intent. So such an act is covered under section 43F. And facilitating illegal access. Somebody has a right to a particular computer, but he is giving that access to someone who is not having the right to access that computer. Is considered as facilitating illegal access without the permission of the owner. This is 43G. 43H is theft of services. In simple language, I will give an example. You are having a Wi-Fi router in your house. You have not changed the default password of your router. Suppose it is a dealing router, and suppose the default router password is admin123 or administrator or 12345, whatever. And on the internet, you key in that model, you will get to see the default passwords. And somebody who is just staying below you or 2 stories down you, he just searches for the network, open connections, and he connects to your router, and he starts using your internet connectivity. So what he's exactly doing is he's stealing the services. right? So this kind of cases can be covered under Section 43H, theft of services. I'll tell you one example, and there was a bomb blast in Ahmedabad in the year 2008. An email was sent from a router which was located in Navi Mumbai's Sanpada area. There was a building by name Gunina, and in that building on 13th floor or 17th floor, this American used to say, his name was Kane Haywood. I remember because I was involved in the investigation. So we started interrogating him because we found his router's IP address in the emails that was sent to various media houses. So we reached to him. We thought he might be involved or he might be connected to this particular blast. So we started interrogating him and soon realized that he was not at all involved. He was a consultant to a company in Thane Belapur Road. There was a company and someone might have used his router probably. So we started investigating and some people were arrested and soon we realized that someone was sitting down in the car. One of the terrorist accomplices was sitting in the car and he was searching for the router which can be accessed remotely by using default passwords. And he could access that American citizen's router, and using that router he sent that email message. So how dangerous you can understand the plight of that American citizen who was under the scrutiny of police for a long time. So if you don't want to go through this kind of plight, please change the password of your router, default password of your router. I hope everybody is able to hear. I'm getting the message that internet connectivity is unstable.
No sir, we can hear you sir.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Thank you. 43I is destroying, deleting, altering information. It is similar to a hacking. Hacker comes into your computer, he accesses your files, he deletes your files, or he, as I said in ransomware cases, he decrypts your files so you're not able to have access to that information. In such cases, Section 43I is applicable. Now, what is the penalty? Penalty for all the offences. Right now, we covered almost 6 to 7 offences under, not offences, but various wrongs under Section 43. So, what kind of damages we can claim in such cases? If somebody does any kind of such act related to us, then we can file a complaint and which we can claim damages to the tune of rupees up to 1 crore. So this kind of damages were claimed in the court. So you will probably think that these kind of cases can be taken to civil court, right? Because usually all the wrongs are filed in civil cases. But no, in this particular under IT Act, civil court has no jurisdiction to try or to run the cases related to compensation. So there is one particular authority which is called as adjudicating officer. So adjudicating officer is one who is IT secretary of the IT department. So in our cases, Maharashtra government has Mantralaya. In Mantralaya, there's a department which is called as IT department, Information Technology Department. That department has a secretary which is of IAS cadre, and this officer has been given responsibility to act as an adjudicating officer. So if you want to claim compensation under Section 43, you can't go to the civil court because civil court doesn't have authority to try these cases or run these cases. So we have to go to the adjudicating officer. Once in a week he sits in Mantralaya in his chamber and he listens to these cases and he can give his verdict on this. And these all the proceedings under him are considered as judicial proceedings. So every judicial office or adjudicating officer has all powers conferred on civil court. So he has all the powers like summoning witnesses, asking for production of documents, and then giving the reply. So all those powers are there with adjudicating officer. And adjudicating officers, I remember one name, Mr. Rajesh Agarwal was there, and he gave a lot of judgments on under Section 43 for compensations. If you Google, you will get a lot of judgments of his, wherein he has penalized many banks who actually they did not reimburse the people who have been defrauded, and where the bank's fault came to notice of the adjudicating officer. So it's a good because you get quick decisions in these matters, hardly 6 months to 1 year, if the adjudicating officer is really keen on delivering the judgments. What about the appeals? In case adjudicating officer is not giving you the relief that you wanted, and you think that you have been denied the justice, you can appeal to the Cyber Appellate Tribunal. Now, Cyber Appellate Tribunal is located in Delhi. It's one for the entire country, whereas the adjudicating officer is individual in every state. But appealing authority is Cyber Appellate Tribunal, and if Cyber Appellate Tribunal gives a judgment, then even if you are not satisfied with his judgment, you can go to the High Court of the concerned state. So we just saw civil wrongs. What are the civil wrongs? Now we are going to look into the next chapter, which is offences under IT Act. Now what are offences? Offences are nothing but criminal cases which investigative agencies look into. They file FIR, they get powers under CRPC to investigate those cases, and then they effect arrest, and then they collect evidences, and then they file charge sheet. So we'll have to understand what are the various provisions under IT Act which are termed as offences. So we have 15 minutes. I think we'll be able to cover that time. Section 65. What is Section 65? It says that tampering with computer source document. So what is computer source document? Computer source document is nothing but the code that runs behind that particular program. Every web page or every program that you run on your computer has a code running behind it. Like on a web page, there is a code named as HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, that actually is understandable by all the computers on the internet. And your browser actually interprets that code and throws that page to you in a human readable format or in a language that you understand. So that is called as code. The code is usually written in various languages like C, C++, Java, .NET, PHP, and then there are many languages depending on the programmer who is going to create that program. That language main code is called as source code. So anybody destroys or conceals or alters that source code, then it is considered as tampering with computer source document. Now we went through various subsections of Section 43, right? So all the subsections which actually told you about what is an illegal access, what is related to virus dissemination, what is damage to the computer. So all those sections become criminal sections when those acts under Section 43 are done dishonestly or fraudulently. So anything that is committed, anything under Section 43 is committed with dishonest intention or fraudulent intention will be considered as an offence under Section 66. What is the meaning of this? So suppose somebody illegally accesses my computer and steals my information. Now I have both the remedies. I have Section 43 remedy as well. I have a remedy under criminal Section 66 also. So I can go to the police saying that, see, this act was committed though under Section 43. This guy has done this particular act with dishonest intention and fraudulent intention. So this Section 66 gives the powers to police to register FIR and investigate into all the cases which are enumerated in Section 43. So civil offences turning into criminal offences. Why? Because those acts were done with dishonest and fraudulent intention. So what is dishonest and fraudulent intention? That is defined in Section 24 and 25 of Indian Penal Code. So we have to refer to Indian Penal Code to find out what is meant by dishonest and what is meant by fraudulent. So it is in general parlance, what we use is almost enumerated there. But most of the police cases you will find the sections applied are Section 43 read with Section 66. Because most of the criminal offences are defined in Section 43. Whereas they become criminal offences when these acts are done with dishonest and fraudulent intention. Now there was a big hue and cry on Section 66A few years back, and Supreme Court handled this issue very diligently, and it went through a lot of fundamental rights mentioned in Constitution of India, such as freedom of expression. Section 66A said that anything offensive in electronic form is sent to someone and that person felt offended, because of that message, he could file a case under section 66A. So in many cases, there was a police action, as and when somebody made a complaint to the police saying that such and such person sent me an offending message. Now please file FIR and arrest him. So in small cases, in daily newspaper news also we go through many news wherein there are certain articles which might be offensive to the person about whom the article is written. So in such cases, people thought that the definition of offensive messages is vast and anybody can file any case against anyone. So the matter went to Supreme Court and Supreme Court took the action on that, and they said that section 66A is violative of freedom of expression contemplated in the Constitution of India. And they struck down this section. So this section is no more a part of Information Technology Act. You cannot file cases under section 66A. Next is section 66B, receiving a stolen computer resource. Suppose take an example. You want to buy a mobile phone, but then since you have your lack of funds, you're going to a shop where the second-hand phones are being sold and you buy a phone. And subsequently it happens that that phone was stolen and that thief sold that phone to the shopkeeper and that phone came to you and police tracked you and came to you. That you received the stolen property or stolen communication device. Now you're in a soup. But this particular section says that if you have reasons to believe that it was stolen one, if you are knowing that it was stolen one, only then that particular section will be attracted to you. So you have your own reasons to tell that I bought it from shop, not from an individual. So how would I know that it was a stolen communication device? So in such cases, police apply this particular section of receiving stolen computer resource. If somebody buys a computer from an individual, and which ultimately he came to realize that it was a stolen one. So you need to have your own defenses before actually buying such stuff. Take a receipt from him, ask him from where he got his computer, find out whether he has the receipt of or the purchase receipt of that particular computer. Otherwise, police action is imminent. You never know it. You might get arrested. So it is always good to go to the shop and buy a computer or a communication device. Section 66C about identity theft. So in the internet, we use a lot of identities of ours. Like we create our Facebook profile, that becomes our identity. We create an Instagram page, that becomes our identity. You have your own login ID, login password for your bank, for your email, that becomes your identity because based on your email ID, based on your account name, login name, back identified you as it is used as a credential to prove that it's you. So you're authenticated based on your identification. So all these are identity elements of you on the internet. And somebody if uses those identity elements, including your photo, your signature, your any other identifying particular like KYC documents on the internet, and he commits some kind of crime, then it is considered as identity theft. So he can be booked under section 66C. So in many police cases where whoever is making a fake Facebook profile or who is making a wishing call and asking you for the information, your credit card details, debit card details, and is using that information to transfer amount from your account, they are booked under section 66C. So these are your identities basically. Punishment for cheating by personation. Somebody using your identity particulars, that you are Mr. X, and though he is not Mr. X, he is using your identity and committing a crime. So nowadays, a lot of cases are coming wherein somebody compromises a person's email ID or Facebook Messenger ID, and then he starts communicating with his friends, asking him to send money to his account. So that way, these cases are happening a lot. They are rampant these days. So this is cheating by personations because you are assuming the criminal is assuming the identity of a person and cheating the third person. So this is how the cases are registered at the police station level. Now punishment for violation of privacy. This is one wherein somebody captures, publishes or transmits private area of any person. Now private area of any person, it's elaborately stated in this particular section what is considered as a private area of any person. So somebody takes a mobile camera and he captures that photo not only capturing, he's publishing also and transmitting also to few of his colleagues or friends. They are actually sharing that particular information. So in section 66 EC, they have said that private area. They have mentioned the private area. What will be considered as private area, and it is self-explanatory. Somebody captures that image. What happens in today's generation? Most of the complaints which come to police station, they are like boyfriend, girlfriend. They're going to some privacy, and a boyfriend captures the video or the photo of the girl in the of the private area, and then when they both don't get along, then he publishes that particular information on various websites. In such cases, police apply section 66E. But if a girl is walking on the road and somebody captures her image, that will not come under this particular section. So there is a lot of confusion amongst even investigative agencies that whether to apply this section, in what cases we have to apply this section. So in such cases where she is walking on the road and now she is standing in the balcony and somebody captures her photo, that will not be considered as 66E. Then some other section you will have to apply. So you must have seen many cases in the newspaper when there were web cameras or the pinhole cameras were placed in swimming pool, changing rooms, bathrooms, and they tried to capture the private part area of various individuals. Next section is section 66F, which is about cyber terrorism. So any terrorist organization or any individual connected to them with an intent to threaten integrity, security and sovereignty of India, they carry out denial of service attack or unauthorized access or computer contaminant. Such acts will be covered under section 66F. Basically, you must have heard about the case where Iran's nuclear plant was brought down to halt just by one virus, which was called as Stuxnet. So Stuxnet virus was introduced into the Iran's nuclear installations, and that virus was sprayed into the various centrifuges which were separating uranium to 35 and through 39, and those centrifuges stopped working suddenly. So one virus can do such a huge damage to your installation capabilities. So this will be covered under section 66F. Obscenity on the internet. This is rampant on the internet. Most of the internet communication, you must have read it in various researches, that more than half of the internet communication is about obscenity, pornography websites. In India, it is a crime to publish or transmit obscene material or any sexually explicit act on the internet. It is happening rampantly in WhatsApp group. It happens, but unless until somebody complains, police cannot swing into action. So obscene material is rampantly distributed in various WhatsApp groups or in various email groups. So this is an offence under Information Technology Act. The parallel to this in physical form is section 292 and 294 under IPC. So anything which is in physical form, such as obscene material in the form of books, or obscene material sung in public, or obscene material in the form of figures, it is considered as an offence under section 292 in IPC, and if it is in electronic form, it will be considered as offence under section 67. Next section is 67B, which is about child pornography. This section was introduced in the amendments which were done in the year 2008. So in the new act, you will find this particular section, child pornography. See, even browsing child pornography. What is child pornography? It is basically engaging children below the age of 18 into obscene acts or taking their photographs in obscene nature. So even if you browse, basically adult pornography and child pornography, what is the difference? In adult pornography, if you are sitting in your house and watching adult pornography, it will not be an offence. But even if you are sitting in your house and browsing child pornography, then it will be considered as an offence. So browsing is also an offence. Whereas in adult pornography, transmitting obscene images or sexually explicit act is considered as an offence. So child pornography, the punishment is also very high. It is 5 years. Then for subsequent conviction, it is 7 years. So I remember one case when I was in police. This particular couple used to come from Switzerland to Mumbai. They used to stay in a very posh hotel in Mud Island. During day, they used to move around in the city. They lure street children, and they used to take them to the hotel. They used to bath them, and they used to take their pictures, naked pictures, or engaging them into some kind of sexual activity, or involving themselves into their sexual activity, and then taking their videos. And they used to take all that material, which was recorded, to Switzerland, process that material, and then they used to sell that material online to various child pornographic groups, which are called as rings, basically. So they were arrested by Mumbai police. Mumbai police raided the hotel. They found a few children in the hotel room, and they found a lot of pornographic material on the laptop of this particular couple. The name was William Marty and Mary Marty. They were punished for 7 years. The punishment was given to them, and they were arrested and then punished. So it's not only about foreigners who are indulged in all these kind of offences. Even Indian these days, these are recent phenomena. In last 2-3 years, I come across the cases where even Indians were involved in child pornography cases. So this one couple from Chennai was arrested. They had 2 websites by name Cute Candid and India Showgirls. They had subscribers from US, UK and Canada. And these couples, when their investigation was carried on, police found 2.4 crores in their account, which were the proceeds of the crime. The money which came through child pornography racket. So this is how in India also it started. Even in August 2008, a group of youngsters used to run a WhatsApp group which was named as BB Bad Boys. They had 217 members across the world, and there was a Bhinder-based college student who was arrested in this case, and he was the administrator of that particular WhatsApp group, and another administrator was from Tamil Nadu. So this is also started happening in India. So I think it is our past 12. I'll just take 5 minutes to show you some important provisions. These are all about rules. I don't want to get into this because it will be too much for you all. I'll just tell you who has the power of investigation for the offences that are registered by police. Earlier it was Assistant Commissioner of Police or DYSP and above. In 2008 amendments, the provision is changed, and now the investigating powers have been given to Inspector of Police and above. So investigative powers have been given to PI and above, the Police Inspector and above. And all the offences which are having 3 years punishment, they are considered as cognizable and bailable. I also don't want to go into this. This is about the forensic examiner. Who can be a forensic examiner? Whenever court needs some light to be thrown on a particular subject, they call an expert so that he can enlighten the judge. Judges cannot. We can't say that judges will be expert in everything. They have to take some advice from some experts to understand very cryptic kind of subjects that they have not dealt with in their entire life. So electronic evidence is one such new subject. They will always want help from some kind of expert, which is also defined under Section 43 of Indian Evidence Act. So in IT Act also, there is a provision for such thing, which is called as examiner of electronic evidence. So as and when court wants some help understanding the nature of the electronic communication or the evidence, they will always seek help of examiner of electronic evidence. And who are these examiner of electronic evidence? The government has published a notification saying that all forensic labs of the state government and the central government will be termed as examiner of electronic evidence. That is why police, whenever they see some kind of electronic evidence such as a hard disk, they send it to the government forensic lab. One such is there in Kalina, and the government cyber forensic lab will analyze the evidence and give their opinion based on the questionnaire posted there. So this evidence is put forth before the court, and court, if required, will call the forensic expert from that forensic lab to throw more light on that particular subject. So this is that provision. Power of police officer and other officers to search. They can enter into any public place and arrest anyone without a warrant who they think that is involved in a criminal offence or is going to commit criminal offence. So I think for today this is sufficient. I don't want to go into other sections from other statutes related to IT Act. As and when we get next time we'll definitely go into this. I want to get into case laws and all because it's a big subject. So thank you very much. Any questions, please ask. I am ready for the questions.
Yes, sir. So thank you so much. I think we all can understand this is a very vast topic as it seems, but you have smartly tried to accommodate in within 1.5 hours and 10 minutes or so. And we really thankful to you. I have received few questions for you, sir, so that we can able to understand what exactly is the status now. So the first question is, sir, you spoke about the virus dissemination. So as this is a very, very sensitive matter, virus dissemination, because it will take a very tough procedures and processes to follow that whether the virus dissemination has happened because of an act of a crime or is that happened accidentally, because the accused will always have a chance to prove it that it has happened accidentally. So what's your take on this, sir?
So basically, we as a company, we have our own company which is called SIDR Solutions. We have done a lot of virus investigations for Mumbai Police and for our clients as well. So we do root cause analysis, RCA we call it. And during that, we actually do forensic analysis of the various viruses found on the system and how they originated, from where they originated. So all that can be tracked very easily because every system has particular mechanism to track that particular activity on the internet. Just like Windows has event management. So in events, we can see what kind of events are generated in the system. So we go to events, we actually capture that virus, we isolate that virus, and then we go into the details, how it acted, how it actually infiltrated into the system, from where it came, on what date it came, through email it came, or in form of some attachment it came. So all that root cause analysis, we do it, takes a lot of efforts, but we do it, and we can actually track, we can actually find out from where it came.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. And sir, another question which is coming from the student side is whether the phone tapping comes under the IT Act.
See, basically there is a provision that I didn't show, it was there in the slides. So there is particular section in this Act which empowers the state government.
Okay.
And there are certain rules related to information, technology, interception and monitoring rules 2011. If you can Google it, you will find that document. So as per that document, a government authority has been authorized to tap certain phones if government official thinks that this particular activity of that person is detrimental to the security of the nation, or police can track it if they think that if that particular communication is important for the investigation of the case or the prevention of the crime. But for that there is a process that they need to follow. They need to seek permission, they need to put forth the proposal to the government. And only if government is satisfied and only if the government gives permission to the law enforcement agency, they will be able to tap that particular, not randomly. It is a general conception that police and government has no other work. They are just sitting there and tapping everybody's phone. Not possible. Humanly not possible. It's completely nonsensical thing. Police doesn't, tapping one phone connection is like listening to it. So one person is engaged to that one particular conversation. He sits there throughout 24/7. There is one person who will be on that particular line, trying to hear what is happening on that line. So you think that the kind of population that we have, government will have the infrastructure to tap those phones? No, not possible. Only in the cases where there is some kind of criminal activity happening. And mostly it is related to terrorist activities, not even common crime activities.
Correct, sir. So sir, we have few more questions. Sir, like the Aadhaar card we now all of us have, and all the sensitive information, including our thumbprints and the retina scan, it is available with the government. So what do you think, sir, what is the probability or that it will not going to be leaked, and what are the control measures that government has taken to protect this data theft, sir?
No, definitely government has taken the measures to protect your information. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for government to control. They have the proper security mechanism in place. They have best of the technology to protect your documents. And they have 24/7 monitoring on the systems that are holding your data. So government has the liability of nature to protect your data, and they can't just ignore such the security of your data. So it is definitely rightly protected. You don't have to worry about that. And you see, there will be a risk in everything. Even crossing the road is a risk on the road that you take. So just because there are certain assumptions out there in WhatsApp group or message circulating in the WhatsApp group, you think that your data is at risk. No, it's not like that. Then everybody's data at risk. Then why are you worried? So don't have to worry. So it's not going to happen. See, KYC documents cannot be used to withdraw amount from your bank account. There will be some kind of two-factor authentication mechanism involved in that. You'll get an OTP. You'll have to have your actual fingerprint put in there to authenticate the transaction. So only on the basis of single factor, no bank transaction will happen. There will always be a second factor authentication or subsequent authentication procedure. So not to worry.
So being the taxpayer, we always hope that our data is protected and are in the safe hands. Sir, I have a last question from the students' point of view, because as you are addressing it to students, and I actually missed the opportunity to introduce you at the beginning to all our students. So first of all, sir, we are running full house here. We are almost 100 people, 100 participants who are listening to your video. We are hoping that it should reach by 200, but the capacity is 100 only. But sir, as I was going through your profile, like BSc, LLB, postgraduate in cyber law, postgraduate in cyber forensics, certified ethical hacker, CISA, certified information system auditor, certified hacking forensic investigator. So it looks like, sir, even though you have done an conventional education, but when it comes about choosing a career path, you've been unconventional, and you have listened to your heart and went into such a domain where people will think many times to venture into. So what's your take for this, sir, and what is the message for us as a law student, sir?
As a law student, listen to your heart, as sir said. What you like most? You like civil side, criminal side, or cyber? You are a very technically oriented person. You can always study cyber law. There's a lot of scope for cyber law. And there are very few renowned advocates in this particular field. You must have heard their names also. And they are making good in their life. And if you are really technically oriented, but see, technology keeps changing. The pace of technology is very fast. So in order to keep pace with that technology, you should be technology oriented. Only then you will have that passion for pursuing this particular career in cyber law. Otherwise, any side, whatever your basic nature is, you can choose any side, criminal, civil, or there are many options available. But then take one particular route, and that will make you excel in your life for sure.
But sir, did you find it difficult when such kind of highly technical cases comes to you, and when it goes for the proceeding in the judges and the court, and particularly the judges who may not be up to that level to understand the complexity of that particular case. So, and when they actually doesn't know that where exactly went wrong, whether accused is means he has done it eventually and it has happened mistakenly. There is a very thin line of margin. So did you come across such kind of cases where the judges even not able to understand what exactly the case is?
Yes, of course, because see, basically judges are also humans. Unless until they are trained or they're skilled in that particular area, they will always have their own. It is your job as an investigating officer. It's a job of a police prosecutor or the defense advocate to make judges know about what exactly the technology is involved in this particular case. So that is why the expert's opinion matters here. And that is why the court seeks the expert's help in most of the cases. They need a document expert, they need a forensic expert, they need a medical practitioner to understand the terminology, to understand the mechanism behind that particular act. So definitely, unless until they are trained, there are special courts for cybercrime, running the cybercrime cases. Every judge will have their own perception about that crime. Unless until their doubts are solved, you don't have to worry. I mean, it's all about the officer who is presenting the case and the police prosecutor who is presenting the case. I came across
right, sir. So thank you so much. Of course. So thank you so much, sir. That ends the part 1 of today's session. And we would like to thank you, sir, for taking out your valuable time out of your busy schedule. And it is really an eye-opening and very informative session from your side, sir. And definitely we will get back to you with another opportunity to listen to you in maybe some other topics. Sir. Thank you so much for being there, Mohit sir.
Thank you for inviting me, and have a nice day. Thank you.